All right, how did I get involved in writing about very old cars? Because my experience was really 48215 Holden, and then in recent years Monaros and Toranas. I certainly don't go back to the beginnings. But my now good friend Harriet called on me to help her run an exhibition back in 14 or 15, wasn't it? It's about shifting gear. And that piqued my interest, I guess. And Harriet suggested that I should research this when we'd finished in detail. It had never been done, research the history of design in Australia. And so she got me involved in a PhD, and there were times when I wondered why I started. But anyway, I have finished, and it's been successful. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong button. Ian showed us a picture of Thomson's steam car, and this is the patent drawing. So that's one of the first things I started looking at, is what did the early tinkerers and builders, and a lot of them were tinkers, very few engineers were involved in building our early cars. They were people who had an idea in a back shed, they had some wheels, they built an engine, and they made a motor car. And Thomson had quite an extensive patent, as did other people. For example, this is the Henry Austin's car, the Pioneer. He also had extensive patents and some marvellous drawings to go with it. A guy called Marcel Certain, he had a brainwave. He drew up this quite detailed drawing that went with his patent, and I love it because he ran out of room on the page and just stuck a bit on the edge so that he could get it in. Nothing came of Marcel Certain's car, but certainly somebody attempted to build it, but it never materialised. And then there were guys like the Woods in Sydney, in Leichhardt. They kind of went about it a different way. They managed to get hold of a Dion engine and they reversed engineered it and they built their own. However, it was a bit hit and miss. All these things are discussed in my first chapter. The last one, I've missed the last one. I discovered that these patents for an engine for a car built by Captain, and his name escapes me now, in Echuca. He was a riverboat captain. He decided to build a car, but he went to great lengths to cast it, and he made all these patents, and they're sitting up there in a dusty case in the museum in Echuca. If you're going past, go and have a look. One of the things that our body industry, I guess, was really our automotive industry. This is the earliest drawing in the coach and motor bodybuilder, or back then it was the Australian coach builder and saddle maker. And this is a drawing that they made specifically for a motor car chassis. Now, it still looks a bit like a horse's carriage. But if you look at Thomson's second version of his car, you can see that body in it. And quite a lot of early veteran cars built in Australia have that sort of style. These are examples of other early Australian motor bodies. The Rolls-Royce was built in Ballarat, which is of interest to me because that's where I come from, and I actually know the grandson of cutters who built it. And of course the bottom one is a Tarrant built motor body. So I made a number of findings. I won't read them out because because my time's been cut short, but quite a few things. I looked at not only motor car designers, but people to design components of motor cars, engines, transmissions, and we have a real history of some really great inventors who produced designs that were successful worldwide, but not here because we never had the market. And some of these things we don't think about. And I'll give you one example. Raymond Moore hydraulic transmission. He built just pre-war, he designed a hydraulic motor, if you like, that he put on each wheel, and he had a pump behind an engine. And so he was pumping hydraulic fluid to each of the four wheels. Now these type of rotary hydraulic pumps are in everyday practice today. If you go out into a building site, you'll see somebody with a rotating device on the end of a crane thing. That's what it is. And there are other examples of that. Anthony Mitchell's crankless engine was driving power stations, quite a number of them all over Australia. There's an engine, a Mitchell engine, sitting in the engineering foyer in this university. I look in some detail at Holden and I discuss some errors in history that have occurred over time, and one is that there's never been any recognition of hacks. Fred Hack. If you read Holden's history, Holden and his son bought Hack's business. Doesn't say anything about Hack. This photo has been taken in 1919 and it purports to be Holden's motor body builders, and it certainly was after they bought it in 1917. But this is Hack's business, and so I set out to correct some of these history errors, if you like, or distortions. Australian cars. I've got a whole chapter on Australian cars. That's the Echo Speedster. And this was the engine was designed by a guy called Jeffress, who was a bit of a speedster. He raced in America and came back here, and he was involved in 2 Australian cars. He was also involved in this one, which was one of the very early chassis-less cars, actually made out of plywood. And this is the patent drawing for forming the plywood inside a mould. Another guy Fredrickson had an idea about improving suspension for Australia's rough roads. And it was a brilliant idea, except that he couldn't sell it because in America there were beautiful paved roads. In England there were beautiful paved roads. Nobody needed something that was handling rough roads, so it kind of failed. And the last one's a guy called Egan, who came up with a brilliant carburettor, but his company failed before it got off the ground. And this is a kind of a theme, I guess, in Australian efforts to build motor cars, is that they all failed, and they all failed because they never had enough money to, they just had enough money to get their car designed and prototype built, but they never had enough money to actually finish the job. Even the Australian 6, and they built 400 plus, or just on 400 cars, failed because they couldn't support the developmental period that takes after you build a car and you get it on the road and the customer comes back and says this fell off and they need to fix it. They never had the money to continue that development, so they all eventually failed. It's quite a long chapter about Australian cars. The other thing that I wanted to explore, I guess, were who were the early designers of the Holden. Particularly, I was interested in the Australian designers, and I found this wonderful photograph of some of the 19 Australians that went to America involved in the design. I knew a lot of these guys because I worked with them from '69. They were still at Holden's, and they're all dead now. The interesting thing is that there's a couple of guys in there. Roy Rainsford's in there, and he went to successfully manage Chrysler Engineering. And Roy Rainsford appears in this photo, on the end there, and he was Chrysler's chief engineer. These are the first Holden designers. These were draftsmen trained by Herbert Wiley, who's in the middle, looking very pleased with his young compatriots. He went to America, learnt the art of layout drafting, brought it back to Australia and taught it. And so Holden then continued this theme of teaching their own people layout drafting. Our first stylist was a female, so I explore the Barbara Stanford, and there were a number of stylists in the early period. Frank Hershey was an American, came out here and he did the styling of the first Holden. Charles Frederick Beavis was an Englishman. He became a successful ran a design studio in Sydney. This is a shot of the art studio, and yesterday I talked about a young artist who did the murals, and they employed a number of young female artists, graphic artists, to do their artwork, particularly in the 30s for brochures and things. Talk about colour harmony and how Australia quickly got on the bandwagon when colour harmony in the States became successful. But not only do I look at Holden's people, this is a Lou Bant drawing, and he won a competition in England with this design. And I've often wondered whether perhaps this would have been the Ford Australian car if they had gone down that route. We'll never know. This was the first Hershey drawing of what they thought the Holden might look like. He redrew it, and I explain why he redrew it. This is the same car, and if you look in the middle of that, you can see the 48215, and that drawing dates back to 1943. That's a little 8th clay model of what Hershey's car would perhaps look like. So there's quite a lot of these old photographs of the early Holden styling, and that's Hartnett's view of what he thought the car. And recently I've just come across 2 letters. One's a letter from Val Stacey in America writing to Hartnett to say why we couldn't have that styling. Not only did Hartnett have planned for a sedan, he had them draw up a station wagon and a panel van and a utility. There was quite a bit of Australian design content, and I explain in there the areas of body design, ceiling, the seating buck was done here, so all the trim and seating, and the trims design, all that was Australian, not American. And one interesting thing that I discovered, this is the patent drawing for the front frame on the Holden. It was designed by Russell Begg, who was the chief engineer, and it's the only car in this era, or up to this area, and probably even later, that the front frame is bolted onto the car rather than welded. If you think about all those cars with chassis-less cars, if you like, monocoque construction, all the frames are part of the body. They're an integral part. But Holden was bolted on. There's the car. There's the cover. Thank you.
Thanks, Norm.